Today's brief lecture is about a short essay by Simone de Beauvoir, 1947, where she is asked the question, what is existentialism? And I think of this as a companion piece to the essay, the lecture that we discussed by Jean-Paul Sartre, Existentialism is a Humanism. So let's see what Simone de Beauvoir has to say about this same question. The purpose of this essay, she says, is that she doesn't really want to define existentialism when asked. She relates how on a visit to America, people are always coming up to her and saying, well, what is existentialism? And she would refuse to answer. And it would be frustrating, but she had her reasons. Some people doubted her intellectual abilities. You know, she lived a lot of her career in the shadow of Sartre, I think, perhaps because of Sartre's personality versus the kind of a personality that de Beauvoir has, but also sexism and culture. The serious people were thought to be the men. It's crazy thinking of her intellectual abilities and the writings and the plays and the essays and books that she wrote. She's incomparable. How anyone can doubt her intellectual abilities is really beyond me. It's just prejudice. Some people, she said, distrust the idea of a philosophy that can't be summed up in just a few words. Think about maybe our own reaction sometimes when we're introduced to a new philosophy. We want to know what it's about. Just give it to me in a nutshell. And the truth of it is, it's often very, very difficult to provide in a nutshell the details, the intricacies, the nuances, and the insights of some thinking that took a long time to come to light and to bear fruit. So some people are impatient. She says in this short piece that she's just going to address some of the misperceptions of existentialism. Again, unlike Sartre was doing in Existentialism is a Humanism. She begins by saying what existentialism is not. Existentialism, she says, cannot be boiled down into a few simple propositions. Existentialism does not provide the key to winning at life. A lot of times we look to philosophy, especially a philosophy like this. We're going to say more about this idea of a philosophy of life, much more. We're looking for strategies. We're looking for a 12-step program, something that we can adopt that will make our lives easier. But as we learn with Kierkegaard, existentialism may be a philosophy whose idea is to make life more difficult, to look for the difficulties of life. Existentialism will not offer a way out of the hassles of life. It's not magic. It doesn't give you some sort of invincibility cloak that you can wear to get through life. It's not just a cultural fad or fashion. Now, there were many faddish aspects to existentialism in the sense that people who took it up, whether they took the time to study or the time to read these existentialist philosophers and all the difficult texts that we've been exploring throughout this course, whether they took the time to do that or not, people took it up and in many ways tried to turn it into a kind of a thing, a kind of a look, a kind of a feel. And both Sartre and Beauvoir resist that. Although I'll give you my 2 cents worth about this. I'm not sure how much they resisted that, because if you think about it, it's kind of cool. You're writing academic philosophy and people pick it up and they run with it. They may not run where you want to go, but it is pretty exciting to think that somebody might find in your thought something more than just the academic. So maybe they're protesting too much sometimes. I don't know. Existentialism is not a political movement, but she quickly says that existentialism does have political and social implications. And again, we will discuss more about that as we go along. Existentialism has been served and disserved by fashion. Like I said, it gets the word out when people are talking about existentialism and dressing like an existentialist, whatever that might be. Maybe it's the black turtleneck sweater and maybe the beret and the cigarette holder or whatever, sipping the apricot cocktail that Sartre and Beauvoir like so much. it gets the word out. It gets you some attention. So in that sense, it's been served by becoming a fad or a fashion or a cultural movement. But it's also done existentialism a disservice because it's led to a lot of misunderstanding, as we saw in the Existentialism is a Humanism lecture by Sartre. Existentialism is not about scandal and outrageousness. And you know what? Some people were looking for that. I think if you were to go on Reddit and take a look at the existentialist subreddit on that platform, you'll see a lot of posts that are about kind of looking for something to poke in the eye of culture. I'm not really sure what that's like. She said people were disappointed to find out that it's an academic philosophy. Maybe you were as well when you took the course. Existentialism, she says, is first of all a philosophy. It's a philosophy that she says is akin to classical philosophy. And if you've heard me talk about this, that's about the good, the true, and the beautiful, but without those things having pre-packaged eternal and timeless forms as Platonism would hold. But it still is having to do with the good, the true, and the beautiful. And as such, she says it deserves the respect that's afforded to the philosophies of Kant or Hegel or many other great thinkers. It deserves that. You can't make demands on existentialism that you wouldn't make on Kant or Hegel to simplify. Those systems can't be summarized in a few sentences, and why should existentialism be? She says it does not lend itself to popularization any easier. And again, I wonder about that, because it was popularized, even by them, even by Sartre and Beauvoir in certain ways. So I don't think there are as many Kantian novels, let's say, as existentialist novels, but we'll see. And like any substantial philosophy, it is only really accessible to the initiate. And I'm hoping what we're doing in this course is to initiate you to this kind of thinking, giving you a lot of background and then having us look at the text in some kind of detail, because she says only in that way could a substantial philosophy like existentialism or Kantianism or Hegelianism or Thomism or whatever really be understood. You must be familiar, she says, with the philosophical tradition from which it comes. And again, that's why I choose to offer this course, reading more of their essays, including those giant-sized books like Being in Time and Being in Nothingness, rather than novels. Although we will look at an existentialist novel or two before this is all over, because you have to understand, as I've tried to point out, that these thinkers are thinking along and against a tradition that precedes it. And the roots of existentialism, as we saw, go all the way back to Socrates, if not before. And she quips, how in the world could there have been an Einstein who would not have been familiar with the classical physics of Newton? It's inconceivable. And that's the same here with existentialism. It didn't just drop from the sky ready-made. You couldn't make the insights that Heidegger and Sartre and Beauvoir are making. You couldn't make those insights if you were not thinking along with this great tradition. And even think about Heidegger with this idea of the destruction or deconstruction of the history of metaphysics. He says, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get rid of it. I'm trying to find out what it was that got covered over, that got lost in that way of thinking about us and each other in the world. And she says that it requires several years of study. Now, I don't mean to discourage you. This may be your very first experience thinking about existentialist thought. But she makes a point. You have to let this soak in. I mean, I just my own background in this. I mean, the first time I read Heidegger, I was a head scratcher. I wasn't sure exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. It took a while for it to sink in. But now that it's sunk in to me, or I've soaked in it for so many years, I can see some of the insights that he was able to develop in his working with and against the Western philosophical tradition. I see that in Sartre and Beauvoir as well. she said, due to a lack of preparation, many of the criticisms that are leveled against existentialism are really aimed at the targets of existentialism themselves, in particular Descartes or Kant. That's kind of interesting, and I think maybe we've picked out a few of those as we've gone along there. Sometimes the criticism, she says, quite frankly, is aimed at philosophy itself. We're Americans. She starts this essay off by talking about her visits to America and people asking her about existentialism. And Americans tend to be not very philosophical as a people. That's not our way. We like to say we're doers. We're not thinkers, as if that somehow is better or superior. I really kind of wonder about that. If you look around all the things that we do without all the thinking, the respect for professors, for philosophers in France and Germany, much higher than it is for here in the United States. When I have a chance to travel in Europe, and people find out I'm a philosopher, a professor, you get a little of this reaction. Ooh, whoa. Here, when people just say, find out, oh, he's a philosopher, like, oh, what's that? So there are people who object to the examined life, to asking these questions. They don't see what they're for. They don't see what the purpose is. They don't see the humanity that informs these questions. And I hope that in asking them that you're able to see the value of those questions. But nevertheless, existentialism did get popular. Why? She said, a lot of other schools of philosophy, they don't generate a lot of public debate in the same way as existentialism does. Well, why is that? Well, she says on page 324 in the book, the reason, in fact, is that although existentialism claims to rest upon the most serious theoretical bases, it also claims to be a practical and living attitude toward the problems posed by the world today. It is a philosophy, yet does not want to stay enclosed in books and schools. Those are the means, not the ends. It intends to revive the great tradition of ancient wisdom that also involved difficult physics and logic, yet proposed a concrete human attitude to all men. This is why it is not expressed solely in theoretical and abstract treatises, but also strives to reach a larger public through novels and plays. So she says, look, it starts as an academic philosophy. A lot of work goes into it, a lot of thought, a lot of effort, a lot of questioning, a lot of energy expended trying to get at a view of who we are, a solid view, a substantial view, a true view of who we are. But then it didn't do that just for the people who are involved, like the Sartres or Heideggers, just to know about that. No, they made that effort in order to help us see those same insights, give us those same kind of lenses on the kind of beings that we are. And, maybe not everybody is able to take a class or sit down and have, an effort, a chance to put forth the effort to read these, big and difficult academic books. Maybe they don't have somebody to, trying to help them out, like I'm trying to help you out. So these thinkers, especially Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus and others, they tried to write other kinds of writings, just like Plato wrote dialogues rather than treatises, in an attempt to promote the wisdom that was being discerned. She also believes that the times that they lived in demand existentialism, and I'm going to make a case before this is all over, that the times we live in demand existentialism, or at least a consideration of existentialism. They demand that we take up the effort to develop a philosophy of life, and I think existentialism can contribute to that. It's not a prepackaged philosophy of life you can just pick up and run with, but it's, as I like to put it sometimes, it provides a toolkit, not the entire toolkit, but a toolkit for a philosophy of life. So, meaning what? The ways of thinking about and understanding ourselves, each other, and our world in terms of practical wisdom. It's about living an examined life. Now, there were leading contenders in her day. Catholicism. France was, despite its secular progression since the French Revolution, Catholicism still had a big hold culturally in France for a long time. Marxism was very important in France, as we mentioned. The Russians, the communists, they fought the enemy of the French, who were the Nazis. So as we say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Marxist and socialist thought got a big hearing in the post-war era. And of course, the existentialism that was being put out there by Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus and others, that was being taken up by people who were looking for some answers. She said all these respond to the same need. In France and all across Europe, the individual is seeking with anguish to find his place in a world turned upside down by two world wars, and in the conceit of Europe, the center of human civilization ripped itself to shreds not once but twice within half a century. The atomic bombs were unleashed in the world, the Holocaust. The world had fallen apart. And people were looking for answers, and Catholicism, a lot of people turned back to it, but a lot were turned off. They're like, I'm not finding answers to that anymore. And what about some new ideas? What about the idea of socialism or even communism? What's this new thing, existentialism? Is there anything in there for us? We who have gone through the turmoil of the first half of the 20th century, how should we think about ourselves? Beauvoir riffs on this famous saying by Blaise Pascal, who we met before. Man is a thinking reed, and she gives Christianity's interpretation of that. She, in her words, Christianity retains essentially the aspect of interiority, in the secret of his heart, by the purity of his intentions, and by the individual accomplishments of the ethics dictated by his conscience, man will attain his salvation in this world. In other words, Christianity, whether you're Christian or not, the skeleton, let's say, the infrastructure of Christianity is interiority. That it's the individual confronting his or her existence, and by purifying their intentions and working according to the dictates of conscience, our job is to try to become as best we can be. It's the ethical impulse, the ethical imperative to be the best we can be. It's about internalization. It's about a turn inwards to find the answers. So the core of the Christian philosophy of life requires an inward turn. Marxism interpretation of that same saying of Pascal, according to Beauvoir anyway, man is a thinking reed. Marxism emphasizes that man is a reed, yes, a thing among things, definable by his relationship with the objective reality of the world. It's about externalization. It's about turning outwards from yourself, turning in solidarity to your fellow human beings, especially your fellows who are oppressed by unjust economic and political structures. It's only in solidarity with others can you be the best you can be. So existentialism's difference from these two possibilities or offerings of a philosophy of life, she says that the existentialism tries to hold those two views together, the internalization and the externalization, but it tries to move past the idea of interior, exterior, or subjective, objective oppositions, as we've seen. Those are binary oppositions that don't hold from an existentialist phenomenological perspective. The individual human being is the source of all meaning, but, she says, has reality only through engagement with the world. That's Heidegger. That's being in the world. That's the anti-Cartesian move of existential phenomenology and hermeneutics. Only through engagement with the world can we make meaning. We're the makers of meaning, but we don't make it in a vacuum. We make it in our facticity. Freedom and facticity in tension. That's the core. That's the key of existentialism, freedom and facticity. So in parallels, like Christianity, the individual must attain salvation. Only the individual can attain salvation for him or herself. That's the ethical pole. Like Marxism, we must work for universal freedom to attain my own freedom. And we'll see her make this argument again later on. In order for me to be free, all must be free. In order for me, to be the kind of being I am authentically, I must have ends that surpass me, because the me that I tend to get selfish about is an article of bad faith, that there's some me that I just am and that's the end of it. No, to be authentic, I have to move to ends that surpass me, and that brings in the political pole of existentialism. For existentialism, then, ethics is not about the formal, eternal, super-terrestrial, she calls them, laws, like Kant's categorical imperatives or Mill's principle of utility. You studied those. Act in such a way that your maximum for acting could be willed to be a universal law, says Kant, or do the greatest good for the greatest number. Abstractions. No, ethics is about the search for a valid foundation of human history, and by history she means something ongoing, something we're in the process of making, and something that comes from our choosing and doing. And we're looking for justifications of us in our situation. Politics, she says, is not about adjusting efficient means toward attaining some unconditioned end. Again, another abstraction. No, it's about the perpetual and incessant, unstopping creation and construction of the end by the means used to produce it. We make our ends, and there's only a way to do it, via the means that we choose, via our actions, via our judgments, via our projects and decisions. We are creating the ends. We're creating the world that we want. Not necessarily that we say we want, but we're creating the world that we want. That's our political engagement with each other. So existentialism rejects the idea of God as the guarantor of good and evil, at least according to her. Again, you know there are religious existentialists. You've seen discussions of them and some of their ideas in your text. But for Sartre and Beauvoir, there's no guarantee that what we call good and evil just is good and evil outside a situation. The idea of ready-made values whose affirmation precedes human judgment is also rejected by existentialism. In other words, there aren't values, she says, that one should affirm in some kind of absolute sense, in some kind of universal sense. Now, there are values that an individual should affirm, as we'll see, but because it's the individual that she or he is, that's different. At least that's the way they want to talk about it. But there's no ready-made values that all should just adopt on pain of being irrational, let's say, or inhuman. The existentialism rejects the idea of prepackaged meaning. There's meaning. We've said it before. We'll say it again many times before this is over. Existentialism is not nihilism. Existentialism is not the idea that there's no meaning at all. Existentialism is the idea that there's no pre-existing meaning, pre-packaged meaning, absolute meaning, abstract meaning. But Dasein, the for itself, consciousness, freedom, transcendence, is all about meaning. It's nothing but meaning, but it's meaning not based on some God-guaranteed, pre-packaged set of values or meanings. Existentialism rejects the idea that the existence of each person is justified ahead of time. What does that mean? Well, that might be a hard saying when you first hear it. Beauvoir is saying here, and Sartre says the same thing, is, nobody gets a pass. Everybody is 100% responsible for the life they live and are living. Everyone is. No one gets a pass and it's okay that I do it. There's something special or different or important or interesting about me. No one gets that kind of pass. You justify your existence, which is what? You're stepping back and making decisions and choices and acting. You're justified in those actions as it turns out. And that includes the judgments of others, as we've seen with Sartre, and we'll see again with Beauvoir. Existentialism rejects, again, those binary oppositions, as we call them, the idealism, realism, individualism, universalism, pessimism, optimism. They just say that's not the best way to talk. Don't try to figure out, well, am I more idealistic or am I more realistic? Just forget those terms. That's not the best way to try to understand who we are and what we're doing. In fact, they'll lead us astray. We'll think of those as the only two options, and we'll think we'll understand those options separately from each other. And by that point, we'll just have been more confused about who we are. We need to find that phenomenological approach to understanding ourselves. Existentialism, she says, respects the fundamental ambiguity of the world, of human beings and their relationships. The fundamental ambiguity. It's not clear that idealism is one thing and realism is something else. It's not clear that there are individuals on the one hand and universals on the other hand. It's not clear. It's ambiguous. And philosophy, you might think, has the job of trying to clear up those ambiguities, and that some philosophy that's resting content with those ambiguities is just failing to do its job. That would be a criticism of existentialism. But the existentialists say the problem is with those people who put their foot down and insist that that ambiguity can be cleared up. It's ontological, it's structural, it's fundamental, they argue. She says, does that leave us with hopelessness? She says, actually, there is no hopelessness. Some think that existentialism is pessimistic because it holds that without human consciousness, the world is absurd. Right? The world's absurd. Beauvoir says, but actually, there's no hopelessness. Since we think that it is possible for man to snatch the world from the darkness of absurdity, clothe it in significations, and project valid goals into it, we very simply rediscover the wisdom of old Montaigne, an important French philosopher, who said, life is in itself neither good nor evil. It is the place of good or evil as you make them. That is an existentialist tenet. Before the fact, that's the idea. It's not that there's no good and evil. Good is what we make of it. Evil is what we think of it and what we do. The world is absurd, taken from an abstract, utopian, no-place point of view. There's no reason for being in itself, as Sartre says. There's no reason for it. It just is. Being just is. It doesn't have some antecedent that legitimates it or accounts for it. It just is. That's what absurdity means. But now that there's consciousness, there's meaning. And now that there's consciousness, there's optimism in a way. And pessimism. There's both. There's not hopelessness per se, although one could be hopeless as a project. That's the way they want to look at the world. It's the way they want to look at their lives. It's we who make it so.